It was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. The scent of 1,000 white roses filled the air. The string quartet played a hopeful melody, and Alara stood at the altar, a vision in lace and promises. But the man she loved, the charismatic millionaire Julian Croft, never said, "I do." Instead, he leaned in his voice, a ghost of a whisper against her ear, delivering 5 words that shattered her world before he turned and walked away, leaving her alone in a sea of stunned faces. Years later, he's back wealthier than ever, holding a diamond that eclipses the sun. But can a ring ever erase the scars of the deepest betrayal? The air in the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel in New York City was thick with the scent of opulence and white roses. It was the wedding of the season, a union between 2 of the city's most luminous figures, Alara Vance, the brilliant and kind-hearted curator of the Guggenheim, and Julian Croft, the enigmatic self-made millionaire whose tech empire was the stuff of legends. Theirs was a love story that had captivated the city, a whirlwind romance that seemed destined for a fairy tale ending. Alara stood before the ornate floral arch, a vision in a custom Vera Wang gown. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of pure, unadulterated joy. She looked out at the sea of faces, friends, family, and the titans of industry all gathered to witness their love. Her eyes found her mother's glistening with proud tears, and then settled on the man waiting for her. Julian was devastatingly handsome, his dark hair impeccably styled and his tailored Tom Ford suit doing little to hide the powerful physique beneath. But it was his eyes, a startling intense shade of blue, that held her captive. They were the eyes that had truly seen her from the moment they met at a charity gala 6 months prior. He wasn't just another wealthy suitor. He was her anchor, her confidant, her everything. The officiant's voice was a low, steady drone, but Alara heard none of it. All her senses were focused on Julian. She noticed the slight tension in his jaw, the way his fingers were clenched into a fist at his side. She attributed it to wedding day jitters. After all, even a man who commanded boardrooms could feel the weight of this moment. "Do you, Alara Vance, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" A smile bloomed on her face, radiant and sure. "I do," she said, her voice clear and full of love. A collective sigh of contentment rippled through the guests. The officiant turned to Julian. "And do you, Julian Croft, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Silence. It was a small crack in the perfect facade of the day, but it was there. The silence stretched, growing heavier, more suffocating with each passing second. The guests began to shift uncomfortably. Ilara's smile faltered. She looked at Julian, her brow furrowed in confusion. "Julian," she whispered. He finally met her gaze, and the look in his eyes sent a chill down her spine. The warmth, the adoration she had come to know was gone. In its place was a cold, impenetrable wall of something she couldn't decipher. It looked like regret. He took a half-step forward, closing the small distance between them. For a terrifying moment she thought he was going to kiss her to seal their vows. Instead, he leaned in close, his lips brushing against her ear. The scent of his familiar, expensive cologne filled her senses, a cruel reminder of the intimacy they had shared. His whisper was a venomous dart, sharp and lethal. "I can't do this, Alara." The world tilted on its axis. The blood drained from her face, and a roaring sound filled her ears, drowning out the frantic whispers that had erupted among the guests. She stared at him, uncomprehending. This had to be a joke. A cruel, twisted, terrible joke. "What?" She managed to choke out the word, a strangled plea. He didn't answer. He simply straightened up his face, a mask of stone. Without another glance at her, at the life they were supposed to build together, he turned on his heel. The solid, confident stride she had always admired now seemed like a weapon, each step a blow against her heart. He walked down the aisle, past the stunned faces of their friends, past the flashing cameras of the paparazzi who had gathered outside, and disappeared through the grand doors of the ballroom, leaving a trail of shattered dreams and unanswered questions in his wake. For a moment, no one moved. The entire room seemed to be holding its breath, trapped in a state of collective shock. Then chaos erupted. Her mother rushed to her side, her face a mask of horror. Her father, a man who rarely showed emotion, looked ready to commit murder. The guests were a blur of gaping mouths and wide eyes. But Ilara saw none of it. She was frozen. A statue of a bride, her hand still outstretched, as if she could somehow pull him back. The 5 words he had spoken echoed in her mind, a torturous refrain. "I can't do this, Ilara." The weight of her gown suddenly felt suffocating. The scent of the roses was cloying, nauseating. The beautiful dream had morphed into a grotesque nightmare, and she was the star of this tragic public spectacle. The humiliation was a physical force pressing down on her, stealing the air from her lungs. She didn't remember much of what happened next. She was vaguely aware of being guided out of the ballroom, away from the prying eyes and the whispers that followed her like a swarm of angry bees. She was bundled into a car, her beautiful wedding dress now feeling like a costume for a role she had never wanted to play. The days that followed were a blur of pain and confusion. Her apartment, the one they were supposed to share, felt cavernous and empty. Every object was a painful reminder of him. The coffee mug he always used, the book he had left on the nightstand, the scent of his cologne lingering in the closet. The media was merciless. The headlines screamed from every newsstand: "Millionaire bolts," "Jilted at the altar," "The Great Croft Escape." Her face was splashed across every tabloid, a symbol of public humiliation. They dissected their relationship, speculated on the reasons for his departure, and painted her as a tragic, pitiful figure. She tried to find him to get an explanation, a reason for the senseless cruelty. But Julian had vanished. His phones were disconnected. His apartment was empty. His company, Croft Enterprises, issued a terse statement about him taking an indefinite leave of absence. It was as if he had been erased from the face of the earth, leaving her to deal with the wreckage alone. The pain was a constant physical ache in her chest. It was a pain that stole her appetite, her sleep, her will to even get out of bed. She was drowning in a sea of grief and shame, and she didn't know how to find her way back to the surface. One rainy afternoon, about a month after the non-wedding, she was staring blankly at the television when a news report caught her attention. It was about a private jet, a Gulfstream G650 registered to a shell corporation that had taken off from a private airfield in New Jersey on the day of her wedding, its destination a small private island in the Caribbean. The Shell Corporation, the reporter revealed, was owned by another larger corporation, which was in turn a subsidiary of Croft Enterprises. A cold, hard knot of anger formed in her stomach. He hadn't just disappeared. He had escaped. He had planned his getaway, leaving her to face the fallout while he jetted off to paradise. The thought of him sipping a cocktail on a sun-drenched beach while her life was in ruins was a new fresh wave of agony. That night something inside her shifted. The grief was still there, a raw, open wound, but now it was accompanied by a new emotion, a burning, all-consuming rage. She had let him break her, but she wouldn't let him destroy her. She had been a victim, but she wouldn't be a victim forever. She walked to the window and looked out at the glittering skyline of the city that had witnessed her greatest joy and her deepest shame. "I will not let you be the end of my story, Julian Croft," she whispered to the empty night. "I will be my own beginning." With that vow, she took the first faltering step out of the darkness. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but for the first time since he had walked away, she felt a flicker of something she had thought was lost, forever hope. She would rebuild her life piece by painful piece. And one day she would be so much more than the woman who was left at the altar. She would be a woman who had risen from the ashes, stronger, fiercer, and unbreakable. And if he ever dared to show his face again, he would find a woman he no longer recognized, a woman who no longer needed him. The months that followed were the hardest of Ilara's life. The initial shockwave of Julian's betrayal had subsided, leaving behind the crushing weight of reality. Every morning she woke up to the same hollow ache in her chest, the phantom limb of a future that had been amputated. The city she once loved now felt like a cage, each street corner holding a memory, each familiar face a reminder of her public humiliation. Her job at the Guggenheim, once her passion and sanctuary, became a source of torment. The pitying glances from her colleagues, the hushed whispers that ceased the moment she entered a room. It was all unbearable. She tried to lose herself in the familiar world of art, in the bold strokes of a Kandinsky, or the serene landscapes of a Monet, but even the art seemed to mock her. It spoke of love, of passion, of human connection, all the things she had lost. The final straw came during a board meeting. A new acquisition was being discussed, a stunning sculpture by a rising artist. Ilara, in her role as chief curator, began her presentation. But as she spoke, she saw the almost imperceptible shake of the head from one of the board members, a wealthy socialite named Beatrice Sinclair, whose daughter had once dated Julian. It was a small gesture, but it was filled with a universe of meaning. It said, "How can we trust the judgment of a woman who is so spectacularly wrong about the most important decision of her life?" In that moment, something within Ilara snapped. She abruptly ended her presentation, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and shame. That afternoon she typed her resignation letter, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hit the right keys. Walking out of the Guggenheim for the last time felt like another death, another piece of her identity stripped away. She was adrift, a ship without a rudder. For weeks she barely left her apartment, the curtains drawn against a world that had become too painful to face. Her friends and family tried to reach her, their calls and texts a constant barrage of concern. But she couldn't bring herself to respond. How could she explain a pain so profound, a humiliation so complete? One evening, while aimlessly scrolling through old photos on her laptop, she stumbled upon a folder from a trip she had taken to Florence a few years ago. There were pictures of her smiling and carefree, standing in front of the Duomo, her face tilted towards the sun. And then there were the pictures of the small artisan workshops she had discovered in the Oltrarno district. She had been fascinated by the craftsmanship, the generations of knowledge passed down through families of leather workers, ceramicists, and jewelers. An idea small and fragile at first began to take root in the barren landscape of her mind. What if she could bring that to New York? What if she could create a space that celebrated not the mass-produced luxury of the big brands, but the unique handcrafted creations of artisans from around the world? A place that told a story that connected people to the hands that had made the objects they treasured. The idea was a spark in the darkness, and for the first time in a long time, Ilara felt a flicker of her old self returning. She threw herself into the project with a feverish intensity, her grief and anger channeled into a new constructive purpose. She spent her days in the library researching business models and import regulations. She spent her nights drafting a business plan, her apartment transformed into a war room of sticky notes and spreadsheets. She cashed in her savings, sold the expensive jewelry Julian had bought her, a collection of glittering lies, and secured a small business loan. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She found a small, neglected storefront in the West Village, a diamond in the rough with good bones, and a charming, historic facade. The work was grueling. She spent long days sanding floors, painting walls, and haunting flea markets for unique fixtures and furniture. It was a far cry from the glamorous world she had once inhabited, but she had never felt more alive. Each swing of the hammer, each stroke of the paintbrush was an act of rebellion, a reclaiming of her own life. She called her boutique Artisan, a simple, elegant name that encapsulated her vision. She traveled to Italy, to Spain, to Morocco, seeking out the most talented artisans, the ones whose work was imbued with passion and authenticity. She wasn't just buying their products, she was building relationships, listening to their stories, and promising to honor their craft. The day Artisan opened its doors was a quiet, understated affair. There was no grand party, no press, no glitterati. It was just Ilara, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear, and a handful of curious passers-by. The first few weeks were slow. The boutique was a novelty, a quiet departure from the loud, aggressive consumerism of the city. But slowly word began to spread. People were drawn to the unique beauty of the handcrafted objects, the stories behind them, the palpable sense of passion that infused the space. They were tired of the soulless, mass-produced luxury that had come to define wealth. They were looking for something real, something with a soul. Alara had found her niche. Artisan became a haven for those who appreciated beauty craftsmanship and authenticity. It was more than just a store. It was a community. She hosted workshops with visiting artisans, intimate gatherings where people could learn about the craft, connect with the creators, and feel the magic of making something with their own hands. The press, which had once been her tormentor, now became her champion. They wrote glowing articles about the curator of cool, the woman who had turned a personal tragedy into a triumph of taste and entrepreneurial spirit. They praised her impeccable eye, her unwavering commitment to authenticity. They conveniently forgot that they had once painted her as a pathetic, jilted bride. Within 2 years, Artisan was a resounding success. Alara opened a second location in Soho, and then a third in Los Angeles. She launched an e-commerce site that shipped to customers all over the world. She was no longer Alara Vance, the woman who was left at the altar. She was Alara Vance, the founder and CEO of a thriving multi-million-dollar brand. She had become her own millionaire, not through inheritance or marriage, but through her own grit, her own vision, her own indomitable will. She was happy, truly happy. The pain of Julian's betrayal had not disappeared entirely. It was a scar, a part of her story, a reminder of her own resilience. But it no longer defined her. She had built a life that was rich and full and beautiful, a life that was entirely her own. One crisp autumn afternoon 5 years after the wedding that wasn't Alara was in her West Village store helping a customer choose a hand-painted ceramic vase from a small family-run studio in Sicily. The bell above the door chimed, announcing a new arrival. She looked up, a welcoming smile on her face, ready to greet the newcomer. And then her world stopped. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the bright afternoon sun, was Julian Croft. He was older, his face etched with lines that hadn't been there before. There were flecks of gray at his temples, and his eyes, those same startling blue eyes, held a deep, weary sadness that she had never seen before. He was still devastatingly handsome, but he was no longer the boyish, charismatic millionaire she had once known. He was a man who looked like he had been to hell and back. He took a step into the store, his eyes sweeping over the beautiful, curated space she had created. He looked at the handcrafted jewelry, the supple leather bags, the vibrant textiles. And then his eyes landed on her. For a long moment they just stared at each other, the space between them crackling with the weight of 5 years of silence, of pain, of unanswered questions. The customer, sensing the sudden palpable tension, quietly paid for her vase and slipped out of the store, leaving them alone. "Alara," he said, his voice raspy, as if he hadn't used it in a long time. She said nothing. She couldn't. Her heart was a wild, frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs. 1,000 emotions warred within her: shock, anger, confusion, and something else. Something she was terrified to name. He took another step and then another until he was standing just a few feet away from her. He looked down at his hands, then back up at her, his eyes filled with a desperate, pleading intensity. "I know I have no right to be here," he said, his voice low and raw. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I had to see you. I had to try to explain." Explain? How could he possibly explain the years of silence, the public humiliation, the utter devastation he had wrought upon her life? The anger, which had lain dormant for so long, flared to life hot and fierce. Explain what, Julian? She finally found her voice, and it was colder, harder than she had ever heard it before. Explain how you destroyed my life and then disappeared without a trace. Explain how you left me to pick up the pieces of the mess you made. There is nothing you can say that will ever make that right. "I know," he said, his voice breaking, "but I have to try. Please, Alara, just 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He opened it, and inside, nestled on a bed of black satin, was a ring. It was a magnificent diamond, a flawless cushion-cut stone that seemed to capture all the light in the room. It was bigger, more extravagant, more breathtaking than the one he had given her before. "I never stopped loving you," he whispered, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I came back for you." The sight of the ring was like a punch to the gut. It was ostentatious, arrogant, and so utterly tone-deaf that Alara felt a fresh wave of fury wash over her. Did he really think that a bigger diamond could erase the past, that he could buy his way back into her life with a glittering bauble, as if the last 5 years of pain and struggle were a mere transaction to be settled? She let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound devoid of any humor. It was the laugh of a woman who had been pushed to the very edge of her endurance and had found it to her own surprise to be a place of unshakable strength. "You came back for me," she repeated, her voice dripping with incredulity. "You have an astonishing amount of nerve, Julian. You don't just get to walk back in here 5 years later with a ridiculously oversized diamond and expect me to swoon at your feet. That girl, the one who would have died in a Vera Wang gown at the plaza. I am what's left." She crossed her arms over her chest, a defensive posture that was more about holding herself together than shutting him out. Her heart was a chaotic symphony of warring emotions. The anger was a roaring fire, but underneath it there was a tremor of something else, a flicker of the old familiar ache, a ghost of the love she had once felt so profoundly. It infuriated her. Julian flinched as if she had physically struck him. He slowly closed the velvet box, the snap of the lid echoing in the silent store. "You're right," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I have no right. It was a foolish, desperate gesture. But I am a foolish, desperate man, Alara." He looked around the boutique again, his gaze lingering on the carefully curated displays. "This place, it's incredible," he said, a note of genuine admiration in his voice. "It's you. It's everything we ever talked about, beauty, authenticity, things with a story. You built it. You did all of this without me." "I did all of this because of you," she corrected him, her voice hard as steel. "You want to know what the foundation of this little empire is built on, Julian? It's built on humiliation. It's built on sleepless nights and tears and the fury of a woman who was told in front of the entire world that she wasn't enough. So don't you dare come in here and admire the decor. You are the architect of the pain that paid for it." The truth of her own words hung in the air between them, sharp and undeniable. He looked down, unable to meet her gaze. The silence stretched thick with unspoken history. Ilara's mind was racing. She should throw him out. She should call security. She should scream until her throat was raw. But she did none of those things. A morbid curiosity, a desperate need for an explanation that had gnawed at her for years, kept her rooted to the spot. "Why, Julian?" she finally asked, the single word encompassing a universe of pain. "Why did you do it? Was it all a lie? Was I just a game to you?" "No," he said, his head snapping up, his eyes meeting hers with a fierce intensity. "Never. It was the only thing in my life that was real. Leaving you was the hardest thing I've ever had to do. It almost destroyed me." "Almost," she scoffed. "Forgive me if I don't have a whole lot of sympathy for your near destruction. You seem to have landed on your feet. I read the financial pages. Croft Enterprises is bigger than ever. You're not just a millionaire anymore, you're a billionaire. So please spare me the sob story." "It's not that simple, Alara," he pleaded, taking a half-step closer. She instinctively took a step back, the invisible wall between them shimmering with tension. "I can't explain everything here, not now. But I can tell you that I didn't leave because I didn't love you. I left because I did. I left to protect you." "Protect me," she repeated, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "Protect me from what? A lifetime of happiness. A future with the man I loved. You call public humiliation and utter heartbreak protection." "Yes," he said, his voice raw with a desperation that was almost believable. "Because the alternative was so much worse. You have to believe me." Before she could respond, the bell on the door chimed again. A man walked in, tall and distinguished, with warm brown eyes and a smile that had over the past year become a source of quiet comfort for Alara. It was Daniel Sterling, a successful architect she had met at a charity auction. He was kind. He was stable. He was everything Julian wasn't. They had been dating for 6 months, a slow, gentle courtship that was the antithesis of the whirlwind romance she had shared with Julian. Daniel's smile faded as he took in the scene before him. He saw the tension in Alara's posture, the thunderous look on her face, and the stranger standing too close, his eyes burning with an unsettling intensity. "Alara, is everything all right?" Daniel asked, his voice calm and steady, a lifeline in the turbulent waters of her emotions. He walked over to her, placing a protective hand on the small of her back. The gesture was both comforting and territorial. Julian's eyes flickered to Daniel's hand, and a muscle in his jaw clenched. The air in the small shop crackled with unspoken animosity. "Daniel," Alara said, her voice a little shaky. She was grateful for his presence, for the solid, reassuring reality of him. "This is an old acquaintance. He was just leaving." She looked at Julian, her eyes cold and dismissive. Julian stared at Daniel, a flicker of something that looked like jealousy or perhaps defeat in his eyes. He then looked back at Alara, his gaze softening into a plea. "Please, Alara," he said, his voice low, intended for her ears only. "Don't do this. Let me explain. Meet me tomorrow. The coffee shop on the corner of 7th and Grove. 10 o'clock. If you're not there, I'll understand. I'll walk away and you'll never see me again. I swear." He held her gaze for a moment longer, a silent, desperate appeal, before turning and walking out of the store without another word. The bell chimed his departure, leaving a heavy, charged silence in his wake. Daniel turned to her, his brow furrowed with concern. "Who was that?" he asked gently. Alara took a deep, shuddering breath, the carefully constructed walls of her composure crumbling. She wrapped her arms around herself, a sudden chill seeping into her bones. "That," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "was Julian Croft." The name hung in the air between them, heavy and toxic. Daniel's expression shifted from concern to a dawning, horrified understanding. He knew the story, of course. Everyone in their circle knew the story, though Alara had only ever given him the barest, most clinical version of the facts. She had never spoken of the depth of the pain, the raw, visceral wound that Julian's name still represented. "Croft," Daniel said, his voice tight. "What in God's name is he doing here after all this time?" He took her by the shoulders, his grip gentle but firm, forcing her to look at him. "Alara, what did he want?" "He wants to explain," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. It was the only way she could get the words out without breaking down. "He asked me to meet him tomorrow." "And you're not going to," Daniel said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, a firm, protective boundary being drawn around her. "There is no explanation for what he did. You don't owe him a thing, least of all your time." She wanted to agree with him. Every rational part of her brain screamed that Daniel was right. Meeting Julian was a terrible idea, a masochistic exercise in reopening a wound that had taken years to scar over. But the irrational part, the part that had spent 5 years wondering why, was a siren's call, a maddeningly persistent whisper in the back of her mind. She needed to know. She needed the final chapter of that story, no matter how painful it might be. "I have to," she whispered, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I know it's crazy. But if I don't, I'll wonder for the rest of my life. It's a loose end, Daniel. I need to tie it up so I can finally truly cut it off." The next morning, Alara sat at a small table in the corner of the designated coffee shop, a full, untouched mug of tea growing cold in her hands. She had replayed the scene with Daniel in her mind 100 times. He hadn't understood, but he had respected her decision. His last words to her a simple, "Be careful, Alara. Some poisons are sweet." At precisely 10 o'clock, Julian walked in. He looked different today, less like a ghost, and more like the powerful, confident man she remembered. He was dressed in a simple dark sweater and jeans, but the air of authority clung to him like a bespoke suit. He spotted her immediately and walked over, his expression a mixture of relief and trepidation. "Thank you for coming," he said, sliding into the chair opposite her. "Don't thank me yet," she said, her voice cool. "You wanted to explain. So explain. You have 5 minutes." He took a deep breath, as if steeling himself for a plunge into icy water. "The day of the wedding," he began, his voice low and urgent, "I received a message. It was a picture of my sister Amelia, sitting on a park bench with a red laser dot on her chest." Ilara's heart stopped. She remembered Amelia, Julian's younger half-sister, a bright, bubbly girl of 19. "It was from a man named Viktor Petrov." Julian continued, his eyes dark with a remembered horror. "His family and mine, there's a history. A feud that goes back to my father's time in Russia before he emigrated. My father, as you know, built his first fortune in oil. What isn't public knowledge is that he did it by ruthlessly driving his partner Petrov's father into bankruptcy and ruin. The Petrovs lost everything. The father died a broken man, and Viktor grew up with a singular, all-consuming obsession: revenge." He leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table, his knuckles white. "For years, Viktor was a ghost, a rumor. But he was building his own empire in the shadows, a far darker one than mine, built on cybercrime and extortion. He saw my success, my happiness, our wedding, as the ultimate affront. He wanted to take from me what my father had taken from his. He wanted to destroy my world from the inside out." The story was so outlandish, so dramatic, it felt like something out of a spy thriller. But the look in Julian's eyes, the raw, palpable fear and pain, was terrifyingly real. The message was clear. Julian said, his voice raspy. "If I married you, if I completed my perfect happy life, Amelia would die. And after her it would be you. He wouldn't kill you quickly. He would dismantle your life, your reputation, your sanity, piece by piece, just to watch me suffer." He looked at her, his gaze pleading for her to understand. "I had a choice. A monstrous, impossible choice. I could marry you, and in doing so sign your death warrant. Or I could destroy you myself in a way that would make you hate me, a way that would sever you from me so completely that Petrov would see no value in using you as a weapon against me. I had to make you a non-target. I had to make it look like you meant nothing to me. So I chose to be the villain. I chose to humiliate you, to break your heart, to make you despise me. Because the only thing worse than you hating me was you being dead." Ilara stared at him, her mind reeling. The room seemed to tilt, the quiet chatter of the coffee shop fading into a dull roar. It couldn't be true. It was too insane, too melodramatic. And yet, it explained everything. It explained the coldness in his eyes, the suddenness of his departure, his complete and utter disappearance. It was the only explanation that had ever made a twisted kind of sense. "I spent the next 5 years dismantling his network." Julian continued, his voice laced with a weary, bone-deep exhaustion. "I used every resource, every dollar, every connection I had. I became as ruthless as he was. I had to go dark to disappear from my own life, to fight a war in the shadows. It was the only way to keep you and my family safe. 3 months ago, we finally got him. Interpol arrested him in a villa in Monaco. He's gone, Ilara, for good." He reached across the table, his hand hovering over hers, not daring to touch her without permission. "I never stopped loving you," he whispered, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "Every single day for 5 years I thought of you. I followed your success with Artisan from afar. I was so proud of you. You were my light in the darkness, the one thing that kept me going. I know I don't deserve it, but I had to come back. I had to tell you the truth." Ilara felt the ice around her heart begin to crack. The anger, the hatred that had sustained her for so long was being replaced by a dizzying, terrifying wave of empathy. The man she had painted as a monster was in his own telling a martyr. He hadn't abandoned her out of cruelty. He had sacrificed his own happiness, their happiness, for her life. But was it the truth? Or was it the most elaborate, most manipulative lie she had ever heard? She pulled her hand back, the warmth of Daniel's parting words echoing in her mind. Some poisons are sweet. It's a very dramatic story, Julian, she said, her voice trembling slightly. I have proof, he said quickly, reaching into his jacket. He pulled out a slim file and pushed it across the table. Everything is in there. Copies of the threats reports from the private security firm I hired, Interpol case files. Everything. She stared at the file as if it were a venomous snake. To open it would be to accept his story, to let him back into her life in the most profound way. To leave it closed would be to walk away forever, to live with the unanswered question, but to preserve the safe, stable life she had built with Daniel. I can't, she whispered, shaking her head. It's too much. She stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. I'm glad you're safe, Julian. And Amelia. But you made your choice 5 years ago. You chose to cut me out of your life for whatever reason. And I have built a new life. A good life. A life that doesn't have room for this chaos. She turned to leave, her heart a battlefield of conflicting emotions. Ilara, wait, he called after her, his voice filled with desperation. I love you. That's the one truth that has never changed. She paused at the door, her back to him, her hand on the handle. For a fleeting, insane moment she considered turning back. But then she thought of Daniel, of his quiet strength, his unwavering kindness, his love that was a gentle harbor, not a raging storm. Without looking back, she walked out of the coffee shop, leaving Julian and his file, his incredible story, and his impossible love behind her. But as she walked down the street, the tears she had held back for so long began to fall hot and silent for the man she had lost, the woman she had become, and the ghost that refused to let her go. Walking away from Julian felt both like an act of self-preservation and a profound betrayal of a past she was only just beginning to understand. Her life, which had felt so solid and well-constructed just 2 days ago, was now fractured, split between a safe, comfortable present with Daniel and a past that was roaring back to life with the force of a hurricane. She went straight to Daniel's architecture firm, a sleek, minimalist space filled with light and the quiet hum of creativity. She found him in his office, leaning over a set of blueprints, his brow furrowed in concentration. He looked up as she entered, and the concern in his eyes was immediate. Ilara, he said, straightening up. Are you okay? She shook her head, the tears she had managed to suppress starting to well up again. She couldn't speak, so she simply walked into his arms, burying her face in his chest. He held her tightly, stroking her hair, not asking questions, just offering his silent, solid support. When she could finally speak, she told him everything. She recounted Julian's incredible story, the tale of feuding families, of a ruthless enemy, of an impossible choice made to protect her. She expected him to be skeptical, to dismiss it as a manipulative ploy. But Daniel surprised her. He listened patiently, his expression thoughtful. When she had finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Do you believe him? He finally asked, his voice gentle. I don't know. She confessed, her voice thick with confusion. It's insane. But the way he looked at me, the pain in his eyes, it felt real. And a part of me, a stupid, naive part of me, wants it to be real. Because it would mean he never stopped loving me. It would mean our story wasn't a tragedy. It was a sacrifice. And what if it is true? Daniel asked, his gaze steady and unwavering. What does that change for you? For us? The question hung in the air, the unspoken weight of their future pressing down on her. She looked at Daniel, at this kind, decent man who had so patiently helped her heal, who had shown her that love could be gentle and safe. He was her present. He was her future. He was everything a rational woman should want. But Julian was a part of her soul. He was the great epic love of her life, a story of fire and passion that had been brutally interrupted. If his story was true, then their love wasn't over. It had been put on hold by a cruel twist of fate. I don't know, she whispered again, the words tasting like a lie. Because she did know. She knew that if Julian's story was true, it changed everything. Over the next few days, Ilara was a ghost in her own life. She went through the motions at work. She had dinner with Daniel. She smiled and laughed in all the right places, but her mind was elsewhere. It was in a coffee shop, staring at a closed file, a Pandora's box of a past she was too afraid to open. The not knowing was a special kind of torture. It was a cancer eating away at her peace of mind, poisoning the quiet happiness she had worked so hard to build. She couldn't move forward and she couldn't go back. She was trapped in a limbo of her own making. Finally, she knew what she had to do. She couldn't make a choice based on a story. She needed facts. She needed proof. She hired a private investigator, a discreet, highly recommended professional named David Chen. She gave him Julian's name, Viktor Petrov's name, and all the details Julian had given her. She asked him to be thorough, to be ruthless, to find the truth no matter how ugly it was. The 2 weeks that followed were agonizing. Every phone call made her heart leap into her throat. Every email sent a jolt of anxiety through her. Daniel was patient, but she could see the strain in his eyes. He was watching her slip away from him back into the orbit of a man who had almost destroyed her. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, Chen called. "I have something for you," he said, his voice grave. "I think you should see it in person." They met in a sterile, anonymous conference room. Chen laid a file on the table, a mirror image of the one Julian had offered her. "He was telling the truth, Ms. Vance," Chen said, his voice flat and professional. "All of it." He walked her through the evidence. There were Interpol reports detailing Viktor Petrov's vast criminal network. There were financial records showing a systematic multi-year campaign by Croft Enterprises to disrupt Petrov's operations. There were travel manifests, security photos, and redacted intelligence briefings that painted a chilling picture of a secret, brutal war. And then there was the final devastating piece of evidence. It was a surveillance photo taken from a distance of a man sitting alone in a car parked across the street from Artisan. The photo was dated 6 months ago. The man was Julian. He was just watching a solitary guardian she had never known was there. The truth washed over her, not as a relief, but as a devastating blow. It was real. The sacrifice, the pain, the lost years, it was all real. He had given up everything for her, and she had hated him for it. She paid Chen, her hands trembling as she wrote the check. She walked out into the rain, the city a blur of traffic and lights. She didn't know where she was going, but her feet carried her as if on autopilot to the one place that had been the epicenter of her new life, her store. She let herself in the scent of leather and wood and dried flowers, a familiar comfort. She stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the beautiful things she had gathered, the physical manifestation of her survival. She had done this. She had built this. She was strong. She was independent. She was a success. But she was also lonely. She had a companion in Daniel, a wonderful, loving companion. But her soul had a partner, and he had been fighting a war for her while she was learning to hate his name. She sank onto a small velvet stool, the enormity of it all crashing down on her. The tears came then, hot and unrestrained, for the years they had lost, for the pain he had endured, for the love that had survived in the most impossible of circumstances. She didn't know how long she sat there, but eventually the chiming of the bell above the door jolted her back to the present. She looked up, her eyes red and swollen, and saw him standing there. Julian. It was as if he had been summoned by the force of her grief. He looked at her, his face a mask of concern. "I saw the light on," he said softly. "I was worried." She didn't say anything. She just looked at him, at the man who had walked out of her life to save it, the man who had watched over her from the shadows, the man who had come back against all odds to reclaim the love he had never forgotten. "I know," she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. "I hired someone. I know everything." A wave of emotion washed over his face, relief, pain, and a deep, profound love. He walked slowly towards her, his eyes never leaving hers. He knelt before her, taking her hands in his. They were cold, and he warmed them with his own. "I am so sorry, Alara," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "I am so sorry for the pain I caused you, if there had been any other way. "I know," she said again, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. She reached out and touched his face, the gesture both of forgiveness and a reclamation. In that moment there was no past, no future. There was only the two of them in the sanctuary she had built their love. A fragile, beautiful thing that had endured the most brutal of storms. She didn't know what would happen next. She had to talk to Daniel, a conversation she was dreading, a good man who was about to be deeply hurt. Her life was about to be thrown into chaos once again. But this time it was a chaos of her own choosing. "You came back," she whispered, her voice full of wonder. "I told you I would," he said, his voice breaking. "I made a vow to myself, the only one that mattered that day, that if I survived, if I made you safe, I would spend the rest of my life making it up to you. If you'll let me." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the velvet box. He opened it, and the diamond glittered in the soft light of the store, a beacon of hope in the darkness. "Marry me, Ilara," he whispered, his eyes pleading, full of a love that had cost him everything. "Be my wife. Let me love you in the light." She looked at the ring, then back at his face. She thought of the pain, the struggle, the lonely years. But then she thought of the surveillance photo of him watching over her, of a love so powerful it would choose to be the villain to keep its beloved safe. A slow smile spread across her face, the first genuine, joyful smile she had felt in days. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Yes, I'll marry you." It wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was something far more real, more profound. It was a choice of forgiveness and a new beginning, forged in the fires of the deepest betrayal and redeemed by a love that had, against all odds, refused to die. What a story of sacrifice, resilience, and a love that truly conquers all. Ilara and Julian's journey reminds us that sometimes the greatest acts of love are the ones we don't understand, and the deepest wounds can lead to the most profound strength. It makes you wonder, what would you have done in their shoes? Could you forgive a betrayal that deep, even if it was meant to save you?
Jonathan Harrington was the kind of millionaire whose charm lit up any room he entered. He commanded attention with a single glance, his easy confidence woven into every crisp suit he wore. At his side, Elizabeth, his pregnant, dedicated wife, carried a grace that quietly spoke of loyalty and poise. But lurking in the shadows was Vanessa Reeves, a striking and ambitious mistress he'd fallen for despite all warnings. On the day the divorce papers were finally signed, Jonathan did the unthinkable. He married Vanessa instead. Little did he know, Elizabeth knew a secret that would blow his new marriage apart, and she left smiling. Jonathan Harrington's rise to wealth had been the stuff of business magazine covers and late-night talk show interviews. Born to a middle-class family in Brookline, Massachusetts, Jonathan had shown an early aptitude for finance. After getting accepted into Harvard, where he brushed shoulders with future power players, he threw himself into the high-stakes world of mergers and acquisitions. By 35, Jonathan had made his first million in a deal that even caught the attention of Warren Buffett, who publicly praised his audacity in a shareholders' meeting. This acknowledgement catapulted Jonathan to the center of business gossip columns, painting him as a young superstar in the making. It was around this time that he met Elizabeth Douglas, a bright-eyed social worker from a modest background who had, by coincidence, attended one of his fundraising galas for a children's hospital. Elizabeth was no stranger to the hardships of life. She'd grown up in a family of 6, barely making ends meet. Something about Jonathan's confidence and the way his eyes lit up when he spoke about helping others made her heart flutter. He, on the other hand, found Elizabeth's quiet strength, her resolve to help people even when her own resources were limited, absolutely magnetic. They dated for a year before he proposed, sliding a ring on her finger in front of a cheering crowd at a charity event in New York. The wedding was a lavish affair, in the Harrington family's newly purchased Newport mansion. Journalists snapped photos of the bride in her elegant lace gown, tears of joy glistening on her cheeks, while the groom looked every bit the proud millionaire in a sleek black tuxedo. Tabloids ran the headline, "Millionaire Marries Social Worker," alongside gushing pieces about Elizabeth's grace and poise. People began to see them as a model couple, he with his unstoppable ambition, she with her unwavering kindness. Over the next year, Jonathan's career soared. He poured himself into new ventures, tech startups in Silicon Valley, real estate developments in Chicago, and even a biotech firm. Magazines described him as the next big thing, with references to Elon Musk's daring or Bill Gates's philanthropic potential. Meanwhile, Elizabeth worked as a counselor at an underprivileged youth center, devoting her time to forging mentorship programs that changed countless young lives. But behind the scenes, their marriage was not as flawless as it appeared in photos. While Jonathan showered Elizabeth with grand gestures, like surprising her with an orchestra to play at her birthday party or whisking her off to Bali for a weekend retreat, he also began to chase ever more demanding business prospects. He spent increasing amounts of time traveling and entertaining potential investors. Late-night phone calls became common. He insisted it was part of the job. At first, Elizabeth believed it wholeheartedly. She never questioned him because she trusted him. He was her husband, the man who had promised to protect her heart and stand beside her no matter what storms came their way. Yet, in the hush of empty hallways and silent dinners, she sometimes felt something was amiss. A sense of loneliness crept in, hinting that the fairy tale might be eroding at the edges. Before long, rumors began to swirl. Subtle at first, whispers in the boardroom, raised eyebrows at social gatherings. Then, ironically, a front-page splash in a tabloid. Millionaire playboy at it again? Elizabeth brushed it off as malicious gossip. Jonathan had always been faithful. At least, that was what she wanted to believe. But seeds of doubt were planted, and in the months to come, those seeds would grow into a thorny, tangled reality that would threaten to tear their lives apart. Jonathan's days became a blur of power lunches, red-eye flights, and multi-million-dollar negotiations. At times, he seemed possessed by the thrill of it all. Untouchable, unstoppable. Whenever Elizabeth tried to schedule some alone time to reconnect, he'd remind her of a critical meeting or an upcoming investor conference he just couldn't miss. Friends and acquaintances began to wonder if Elizabeth was simply turning a blind eye to keep the facade of a perfect marriage. In a bid to bridge the growing gap, Elizabeth decided to plan a special homecoming dinner for Jonathan. She spent hours cooking his favorite meal, roasted duck with orange glaze, garlic mashed potatoes, and a side of sautéed asparagus. She set the table with their finest china, a wedding present from her late grandmother. Soft jazz filtered through the living room, candlelight dancing on the walls. Elizabeth prayed this evening would rekindle the warmth they once shared. Jonathan arrived home past 9, exhausted from back-to-back meetings. He plopped onto a dining chair, absent-mindedly loosening his tie. Before he could launch into the same old complaint about work stress, Elizabeth took a deep breath and announced, "I'm pregnant." For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. Jonathan's expression cycled through surprise, joy, and then apprehension. He embraced her, wearing a forced smile that Elizabeth tried to ignore, attributing his tension to weariness. That night, he promised her a real celebration. Just not then, he was too tired. Yet the pregnancy did little to slow Jonathan's relentless pursuits. He threw himself deeper into his empire-building projects, determined to make an even bigger name for himself. Underneath his professional triumphs, a slow-burning restlessness began to pulse through him. Every time he closed a deal, he felt a fleeting rush, but moments later, an emptiness took hold. It was like chasing a mirage. The satisfaction never lasted. That was when Vanessa Reeves crossed his path. She was a striking brunette in her late 20s, a marketing consultant with a sharp intellect and an even sharper tongue. She strutted into one of Jonathan's cocktail receptions on the arm of an investment banker. Dressed in a sleek black gown, she exuded confidence and allure. Jonathan couldn't help but notice the way her eyes flickered in his direction throughout the evening. Vanessa worked for an up-and-coming PR firm rumored to have ties to big tech. She pitched Jonathan's company on a new brand development strategy. Their initial conversations were all business, meetings in plush boardrooms, guarded flirtations disguised as witty banter. But as they spent more time together, the chemistry between them crackled with undeniable intensity. Elizabeth, meanwhile, battled morning sickness that sometimes stretched into afternoon and night. She visited her doctor alone, waiting on stiff chairs in the clinic, wishing Jonathan were there to hold her hand. She told herself he was busy, that he'd be there for the important appointments. But deep down, a shadow of doubt darkened each day. Whenever he returned home, his mind seemed elsewhere, preoccupied, distant. She worried her pregnancy was more of a burden than a blessing to him, but she tried to push that thought away. As Elizabeth's belly grew, so did her longing for the closeness they once had. But Jonathan buried himself deeper in the high-octane world of corporate life. His phone buzzed continuously, texts, emails, late-night calls. The name Vanessa Reeves appeared more frequently in his schedule. Elizabeth tried to ask him about her once, in passing, and he casually brushed it off. "Just a marketing consultant," he said, with a dismissive wave of his hand. Yet, their marriage bed began to feel colder. Jonathan worked late or claimed he was too tired for any real conversation. He swore he was just pushing through a tough quarter. But Elizabeth sensed something else, something that made her heart tighten. She pretended not to see the suspicious receipts, the overabundance of business dinners, the frequent out-of-town trips. Every time she thought to bring it up, the image of their unborn child flashed before her eyes. She would swallow her fears, convincing herself it was only a phase, that Jonathan would soon come around. Little did she know, events were already in motion, and the life she had built with Jonathan was heading toward a dramatic fork in the road, one that would test every vow they'd ever made to each other. Vanessa Reeves was not the type of woman to settle for mediocrity. Raised in a household that valued glamour over loyalty, she learned early on how to work a room and captivate anyone she met. She was every bit as ambitious as Jonathan, but her tactics were far more cunning. She loved the thrill of a challenge, and Jonathan Harrington was a prize worth chasing. Their encounters shifted from stuffy conference tables to upscale lounges and restaurants. At first, they excused the meetings as essential to finalize marketing strategies. Over martinis garnished with olives, they'd talk business, flirting behind polite smiles. Often, these evenings ended in the glow of streetlights, with Jonathan driving Vanessa home, both of them lingering at her door longer than they should. Within weeks, their business relationship had evolved into something more intimate. Vanessa invited him to after-parties attended by celebrities and influential personalities. She introduced him to her circle of glamorous friends, painting a picture of a life beyond the stable, predictable world he shared with Elizabeth. Each time Jonathan felt a pang of guilt, Vanessa would smile, lean in, and whisper that he deserved more in life, more excitement, more passion. In the swirl of neon lights and champagne bubbles, Jonathan convinced himself that he was simply exploring possibilities, living his life to the fullest. After all, wasn't he the man everyone admired for his boldness? But as the weeks progressed, the line between excitement and betrayal blurred. They began to meet in secret at luxury hotels. Text messages were exchanged at all hours. The euphoria of their affair was a drug, and Jonathan found himself craving the high even though his conscience told him to stop. Elizabeth, in her own quiet world, was determined to keep the marriage afloat. She enrolled in prenatal classes, reading up on holistic birthing methods. She painted the spare room in a soft shade of yellow, picking out furniture that would create a tranquil haven for their child. Whenever Jonathan seemed stressed, she offered back rubs and words of encouragement. Sometimes he'd mumble a quick, "Thanks," but his eyes betrayed distraction. More cracks appeared in their relationship. Elizabeth noticed strange charges on their credit card statements, expensive dinners at times he claimed to be in meetings, a jewelry store purchase she didn't recognize. She even spotted a faint lipstick stain on his collar once, the color a shade she'd never wear. At night, she lay awake, tears soaking her pillow, wondering if she was enough. Jonathan, unable to face the truth of his duplicity, adopted a strategy of evasion. He gave Elizabeth half-baked excuses, claiming everything he did was for the financial security of their growing family. Deep inside, he sensed he was slipping from the man he used to be, a devoted husband who once valued love and loyalty above all else. Friends started noticing the tension. One evening, at a mutual friend's birthday dinner, Elizabeth sat alone, while Jonathan spent most of his time huddled with a group of acquaintances, telling stories of new ventures. She caught him texting under the table, a small frown etched on his brow. When she asked who he was texting, he claimed it was just a colleague. A fleeting sense of shame crossed his features, but it vanished as quickly as it came. Behind the scenes, Vanessa was orchestrating her maneuvers. She showered Jonathan with compliments, fueling his ego. She hinted about a future with him, describing vacations in Monaco and lavish parties in Miami, a shared life free from the mundane responsibilities that came with being married. She played the role of the understanding confidant, someone who got him, who didn't weigh him down with obligations. For Jonathan, torn between guilt and infatuation, the affair felt like a whirlwind of adrenaline that kept him from acknowledging the cracks in his conscience. But as the saying goes, every high has its crash, and the higher the climb, the more catastrophic the fall. Neither he nor Vanessa realized just how destructive their game would become, not just for Elizabeth, but for themselves as well. One chilly October afternoon, Elizabeth decided to take the day off from her usual volunteer work and surprise Jonathan at his office with homemade cookies, a gesture of warmth she hoped would break through the growing ice between them. Balancing a small basket of chocolate chip delights, she passed through the sleek glass doors of Harrington Enterprises. The receptionist greeted her politely, but Elizabeth sensed a flicker of unease in the woman's eyes. Jonathan was in a meeting, or so Elizabeth was told. She took a seat in the plush waiting area, flipping through a glossy business magazine featuring Jonathan's face on the cover. Minutes turned into a quarter hour. Eventually, the elevator doors slid open, and out stepped Vanessa Reeves, hair perfectly coiffed, wearing a fitted cream-colored dress that accentuated every curve. She paused when she saw Elizabeth, a momentary flash of surprise crossing her face. Elizabeth had never seen Vanessa in person before, but intuition flared. Something in Vanessa's smug, knowing smile felt like a silent declaration of war. Clutching the basket of cookies tighter, Elizabeth stood and approached. "You must be Vanessa Reeves," she said softly, forcing a polite smile. "I've heard Jonathan mention you." Vanessa responded with a practiced grin. "Ah, yes, Mrs. Harrington. He's mentioned you too. Congratulations on your pregnancy." The tone was friendly, but Elizabeth detected a hint of condescension. Vanessa's gaze dipped, almost dismissively, to Elizabeth's swelling belly. Before Elizabeth could reply, Jonathan emerged from the conference room, surprise evident on his face to see his wife and mistress in the same space. His posture tensed, but he quickly regained composure. "Liz, what a pleasant surprise," he said, striding forward to greet her with a kiss on the cheek. He turned to Vanessa. "I'll see you back at the office later. Thanks for your input." Vanessa gave them both a parting smile and stepped back into the elevator. Elizabeth attempted to mask her confusion, her heart pounding. She offered Jonathan the basket of cookies, telling him she missed him and wanted to do something thoughtful. Jonathan thanked her, but his eyes flicked to the elevator, worry etched in his features. He ushered Elizabeth into his private office, quickly closing the door behind them. "Listen," he said, clearing his throat. "Vanessa is just a consultant we hired. She's helping us with some brand strategies for our new project. She can be a bit intense, but she's good at her job." Elizabeth nodded, forcing a smile. She wanted to believe him. She needed to believe him for the sake of their unborn child. But her instincts screamed otherwise. There was something too familiar about the way Vanessa had looked at her, something that suggested a deep personal involvement with Jonathan. Days later, Elizabeth confided in a close friend, Margaret Turner, a counselor at the youth center. "I'm worried," she admitted, tears brimming. "I can't shake the feeling something is going on between Jonathan and that woman." Margaret listened intently, her warm eyes full of empathy. "Have you considered talking to a marriage counselor, Liz? Sometimes an unbiased professional can help clarify these feelings." Elizabeth nodded. She wanted to do everything she could to save her marriage. But deep down, she feared that if her suspicions proved correct, it would shatter her. That night, she laid awake again, her hand cradling her belly, silently praying for strength. Meanwhile, Jonathan's affair with Vanessa grew bolder. She peppered him with texts and calls at all hours, urging him to break away from his dull domestic life and claim the life he deserved. One morning, Jonathan awoke to an email containing explicit photos she'd sent, with a suggestive line hinting at how he should spend his next business trip. In the midst of all this, Elizabeth discovered she'd been accepted into a specialized prenatal program for couples, aimed at teaching mindfulness and stress reduction techniques. Excited, she broached the subject with Jonathan, hoping he'd see it as a chance to reconnect before the baby arrived. He agreed to attend one session, if only to appease her. During that session, the counselor asked them to face each other, place a hand on each other's heart, and express gratitude for the little things. Elizabeth's eyes misted when she spoke about how Jonathan's success had given her the resources to help more people. Jonathan mumbled about being grateful for Elizabeth's support, but the sincerity was hollow, his gaze flicking away when her tears fell. As they left, Elizabeth felt more alone than ever. The cracks in their marriage had grown into a chasm, and Elizabeth, with her heart on the line and a child in her womb, began to realize she might be fighting a losing battle. Yet she wasn't one to surrender easily. With every breath, she reminded herself of the life inside her, of the love she once shared with Jonathan. She clung to hope, even as the specter of betrayal loomed larger by the day. Vanessa Reeves had an agenda far more calculated than Jonathan realized. She was well aware of Elizabeth's pregnancy. News traveled quickly in social circles, especially when the father was a high-profile millionaire. While Jonathan saw their affair as a thrilling escape, Vanessa saw a jackpot. She dated wealthy men before, but none with Jonathan's clout or potential. She wanted to secure her position in his life, and more importantly, in his bank accounts. She began with small manipulations. Whenever Jonathan expressed concern about his wife's well-being, Vanessa subtly mocked Elizabeth's fragile state, suggesting that perhaps Elizabeth wasn't strong enough to be the partner he needed. She never outright told him to leave his wife. Instead, she planted seeds of doubt, letting them take root in Jonathan's mind. To further entangle him, she proposed that he invest in an exclusive real estate venture she was supposedly helping spearhead. Promising massive returns, she dangled the prospect of prestige and influence. "Just imagine," she purred into his ear one evening at a penthouse party, "you and I at the top of this city's social ladder, owning prime blocks of property, shaping the skyline. It's everything you've worked for, Jonathan." The dream she painted was irresistible to a man addicted to success. Still, Vanessa sensed that Jonathan hesitated, chained by guilt and a sense of obligation to his pregnant wife. So, she upped her game. She made sure her presence was felt in every facet of his life. She'd show up unexpectedly at his office with lunch, always dressed in a way that made heads turn. She emailed him detailed breakdowns of her business idea, ensuring he saw how much she'd done just for him. During late-night rendezvous, she lavished him with praise, making him feel like an unstoppable force. Even Jonathan's business partners began to notice the shift. A few discreetly cautioned him about getting too involved, but he was too far gone in his double life. He wanted Vanessa's excitement, her audacious energy, yet he also wanted to maintain the respectability of his marriage, particularly with a child on the way. He assured himself that he could handle it. Elizabeth, meanwhile, was retreating into her own silent world of heartbreak. She hardly recognized the man Jonathan was becoming, but she still clung to the dream of a happy family. In her quiet moments, she collected her thoughts, writing in a journal about her hopes for the baby and the love she once felt from Jonathan. If he would just snap out of it, she told herself, everything could be saved. A turning point came when Vanessa managed to corner Elizabeth at a charity event. Elizabeth was volunteering as part of the youth center's fundraising committee, helping set up tables and greeting donors. Vanessa arrived on Jonathan's arm, wearing a figure-hugging red dress. Publicly, she was introduced simply as a colleague, but the knowing looks between them told Elizabeth everything. Jonathan barely spoke to Elizabeth the whole night, preoccupied with parading Vanessa among wealthy benefactors, forging new connections. At one point, Elizabeth found herself alone in a hallway, gathering her composure. That's when Vanessa materialized like a phantom. She leaned against the wall, a smirk playing on her glossy lips. "I've heard you're expecting soon," Vanessa said. "Must be nice to know that Jonathan's going to be a father. He's great with children, isn't he?" The question dripped with insinuation. Elizabeth's chest tightened. "Yes, he'll be a wonderful father," she replied, forcing a polite tone, despite the anger burning inside her. Vanessa's expression was smug, practically victorious. "Well, I hope you're taking good care of yourself. Stress isn't good for the baby." With that, she sauntered off, leaving Elizabeth trembling. In the car ride home, Elizabeth confronted Jonathan through tears, asking him outright if he was having an affair. He denied it vehemently, raising his voice in an uncharacteristic outburst. "Why must you always assume the worst?" he snapped, ignoring the tear-streaked look of betrayal on her face. "Vanessa is a critical part of our new marketing push. You have no idea how business works." Elizabeth withdrew, hugging her belly protectively. She realized that no matter how much she wanted to fix things, Jonathan was spiraling into a world that had no space for her. Yet, there was a spark of determination left. If Jonathan was slipping away, she would fight to preserve her dignity, even if it meant letting him go. Unbeknownst to both of them, Vanessa had more tricks up her sleeve. She wasn't satisfied just being the mistress. She craved legitimacy, adoration, and the glittering promise of marriage. And in her mind, she had already begun orchestrating the downfall of Elizabeth Harrington. It was late November when Jonathan received a cryptic message from Vanessa. "We need to talk, urgent." He glanced at the text, nerves on edge, wondering if she was about to drop a bombshell. Perhaps a pregnancy scare, or maybe some business deal gone awry. He left his office early to meet her at a discreet lounge a few blocks away. Vanessa arrived wearing a long trench coat, cinched at the waist, her eyes hidden behind large sunglasses. She slipped into the booth across from him and ordered a glass of Merlot. Without preamble, she began, "Jonathan, I'm tired of playing second fiddle. We need to make a decision about us." Alarm bells rang in Jonathan's mind. He sipped his whiskey, trying to project calm. "What do you mean?" "I've given you every opportunity to be happy," she said, her gaze unwavering. "And yet, you're still going home to Elizabeth. She's pregnant, sure, but be honest with yourself. Are you truly in love with her?" Jonathan exhaled, feeling cornered. He couldn't deny his passion for Vanessa, yet he also couldn't sever the bond with his wife, especially with a baby on the way. It was as if he stood on a precarious cliff, the slightest push sending him tumbling into an abyss. "This is complicated," he managed. "I do care about Elizabeth. She's the mother of my child." Vanessa sneered, her composure cracking. "Care about her all you want, Jonathan, but that won't change the fact that we have something real. And if you're not going to make it official, I might have to look elsewhere." The threat hung in the air like poison. He should have walked away then. But instead, he found himself apologizing, trying to placate her. The conversation ended with a promise that he'd sort out his marital issues soon. That night, he stared at Elizabeth, asleep in their bed, her hand protectively over her belly. Guilt and longing warred in his mind. Meanwhile, Elizabeth was not as naive as Jonathan assumed. She'd hired a private investigator, a middle-aged ex-cop named Walter Green, who discreetly followed Jonathan's movements. Within a week, Walter delivered photographs, Jonathan and Vanessa entering a hotel lobby, leaving hand in hand, sharing an intimate moment in the car. The evidence was damning. Heart-pounding, Elizabeth spread the photos across her kitchen table. Tears blurred her vision, but she refused to give in to despair. She was pregnant, vulnerable, but she was not powerless. She consulted a divorce lawyer recommended by Margaret. The lawyer suggested she gather more evidence before filing. If Jonathan was going to betray her, at least she would secure her child's future. Jonathan's phone buzzed continuously with Vanessa's messages. Some nights, he escaped to Vanessa's penthouse. Others, he stayed at the office, burying himself in spreadsheets and mergers to numb the guilt. His company's board members were beginning to talk. Even his longtime friend and financial advisor, Daniel Wu, took him aside one day. "Whatever's going on in your personal life, get it under control," Daniel warned, "or you'll lose everything you've built." But Jonathan was too entangled in Vanessa's web. Each time he tried to break it off, she'd reel him back with promises or threats. She'd whisper about the incredible future they could share, while also reminding him of how easily she could create a scandal that would ruin him. Stuck in a vortex of lust, ambition, and fear, Jonathan pushed forward as if by inertia. At home, Elizabeth continued to play the dutiful wife, cooking dinners that he rarely touched, updating him on doctor visits he never attended. A new routine set in. He'd mumble excuses. She'd pretend to believe them, all while carefully gathering evidence. She knew confronting him outright would only make him defensive. Patience, she realized, could be her greatest weapon. The tension weighed heavily in the mansion's air. Servants walked on eggshells, noticing the forced smiles, the stony silences. Friends saw less and less of the couple socially, as invitations were often extended to Jonathan plus Vanessa instead of Jonathan and Elizabeth. The dream life they had flaunted for magazines was collapsing, brick by brick. And yet beneath Elizabeth's heartbreak lay a resolute core of strength. She had a child to protect, and she refused to be cast aside without a fight. Even if it meant letting Jonathan go, she'd do it on her own terms. Little did Jonathan realize the magnitude of what was about to unfold. The day Elizabeth would finally stand tall, unveiling truth after truth, and leaving him utterly shell-shocked by the consequences of his betrayal. By the time Elizabeth reached her 8th month of pregnancy, she had all the evidence she needed. The private investigator's photos, phone records linking Jonathan and Vanessa's clandestine meetups, even eyewitness accounts from a few hotel staff who recognized Jonathan. The heartbreak was immense, but Elizabeth channeled her pain into a clear focus: protect herself and her unborn child. One winter evening, she prepared a special dinner at home. She set the table elegantly, placing 2 tall candles in the center. She wore a simple but graceful maternity dress that accentuated her rounded belly. When Jonathan walked in, his tie loose, coat hung over his arm, he paused at the sight of the well-set table. "What's all this?" he asked warily. Elizabeth forced a smile, pushing past the hurt lodged in her chest. "I thought we should have a conversation over dinner." He nodded, trying to recall the last time they'd had a civil meal together. They sat, clinking glasses of sparkling water. The tension in the air was thick, as Elizabeth served them grilled salmon with lemon butter sauce. After a few bites, she said quietly, "Jonathan, I know about Vanessa." She spoke the name plainly, without drama. He nearly choked on his fish, color draining from his face. "Liz, let me explain," he began, but she raised a hand to stop him. She wasn't interested in excuses. Elizabeth pulled out a folder containing the evidence. She handed it to him, her eyes unwavering. "I've spoken to a lawyer. I'm prepared to file for divorce." Jonathan thumbed through the pages, his face contorting into shock and guilt. "You hired someone to follow me?" he asked, half angry, half astonished. "I did what I had to do," she said. "You lied to me for months. You flaunted that woman in public. And I may have a child to raise soon, our child, but that doesn't mean I'll tolerate disrespect or betrayal." Jonathan swallowed hard, tears forming in the corners of his eyes. Part of him wanted to apologize, to plead for forgiveness. But another part, the side influenced by Vanessa's cunning whispers, told him not to show weakness. "Look, Elizabeth, I'm sorry you found out this way. But you have to understand, our marriage hasn't exactly been perfect." Elizabeth's voice trembled only slightly as she cut him off. "Is that supposed to be an excuse?" She let out a shaky breath, placing a protective hand on her belly. "I'm giving you a choice. We can go through with the divorce, or we can try to work on our marriage. But if we try to work on it, you have to end all contact with Vanessa. immediately, irrevocably, and you have to seek counseling with me. Otherwise, I file the papers." Jonathan hesitated, remembering Vanessa's ultimatum and her repeated promises of a thrilling future. He also recognized the gravity of Elizabeth's request. She was his wife, the mother of his child, the woman who had stood by him when he was nobody. But the hold Vanessa had on him was strong, and the idea of losing that rush felt suffocating. "I need time to think," he stammered. He could see the disappointment flicker across Elizabeth's face. Nonetheless, she simply nodded, tears threatening to spill over, and stood from the table. "You have 1 week," she said softly. "By then, I'll expect your decision." With that, she turned and headed upstairs, leaving her untouched dinner plate on the table. That night, Jonathan slept in his study, too conflicted to face his pregnant wife. He tossed and turned on the leather couch, phone in hand, scrolling through messages from Vanessa, reading the latest property deal she dangled in front of him. He thought about his unborn child, the empire he had built, and the public scandal this would unleash if he went through with a divorce. Stress consumed him, as did a gnawing fear of losing everything. 3 days later, he still hadn't given Elizabeth his decision. Instead, he met Vanessa at a secluded bar, telling her about Elizabeth's ultimatum. "I can't keep living like this," he admitted, frustration clouding his features. Vanessa's response was immediate. "Leave her. You said it yourself. The marriage is basically over. Why not finalize it? We can go public and shape a narrative that suits us." She pinned him with a direct stare, then added, "I can give you a life that Elizabeth never could. You know that." In the haze of whiskey and Vanessa's unwavering gaze, Jonathan agreed. He'd divorce Elizabeth. He found himself rationalizing it. Better to end it cleanly than drag out a dead marriage. And he was certain Vanessa was the more exciting choice. "I'll talk to my lawyer," he muttered, ignoring the pang of sorrow in his chest. Soon after, Elizabeth received the news in the form of a curt conversation with Jonathan. He stood rigid, telling her he wanted a divorce. She didn't scream or cry in front of him. She simply listened, nodded, and retreated to the bedroom. Only when she was alone did she allow tears to flow, sobs racking her body as she held her pregnant belly, murmuring apologies to her unborn child for the broken home it would enter. Little did Jonathan realize, the divorce would not be the final act. Instead, it would be the opening scene of a drama that would twist in ways none of them expected, especially on the day he pledged himself to Vanessa, while Elizabeth remained in the shadows, holding on to an explosive truth. The news of Jonathan and Elizabeth's divorce spread like wildfire through high society circles. Gossip columnists had a field day. Millionaire dumps pregnant wife for sultry mistress. While Jonathan tried to manage the narrative, Vanessa embraced the attention, orchestrating exclusive interviews that portrayed their relationship as fated and irresistible. She even hinted that the timing of Elizabeth's pregnancy had been an attempt to cling to a failing marriage, which only fueled tabloid speculation. Elizabeth retreated from the public eye. She needed to focus on her health and the babies. A few close friends rallied around her, offering emotional support and discreet legal advice. But she remained stoic. She refused to beg Jonathan to stay or to make a spectacle of herself in the media. She allowed her lawyers to handle most of the negotiations, ensuring she and her child would be financially stable once the divorce was finalized. In a matter of weeks, the divorce went through, astonishingly quick for such a high-profile couple. Money and influence smoothed out the usual bureaucratic hurdles. Jonathan's team spun the story as a mutual decision, but the tabloids screamed otherwise. Elizabeth's lawyer secured a hefty settlement package, but the heartbreak overshadowed any material gain. Jonathan had barely signed the final documents when Vanessa insisted on a destination wedding. She was hungry for the spotlight and wanted to prove her status as the new Mrs. Harrington. They chose Lake Como, Italy, for its picturesque scenery, renting out a luxurious villa perched on the water's edge. High-profile guests received elaborate invitations embossed with gold leaf. Celebrities, business moguls, and socialites from across Europe and America flew in. Cameras clicked incessantly, capturing Vanessa in a stunning designer gown as she made her grand entrance. Jonathan stood at the altar, looking dapper in a custom-tailored tux. He tried to focus on the moment, ignoring the pang of regret that flickered whenever he thought of Elizabeth. He reassured himself that this was his fresh start, a leap toward a more exciting life. Vanessa glided down the aisle, her smile wide and triumphant. The ceremony was lavish. Flowers imported from Holland, a string quartet flown in from Vienna, champagne from the finest vineyards in France. It was everything Vanessa had dreamed of. Back in the States, Elizabeth watched the headlines in quiet resignation. She was close to her due date and decided not to dwell on Jonathan's public spectacle. Her child's health and her own peace of mind were her priorities. Besides, she had uncovered something that would turn this entire narrative on its head. Vanessa was not who she claimed to be. With the help of Walter Green, the private investigator, Elizabeth had discovered a tangled web of forged documents, shell companies, and bankrupt accounts linked to Vanessa Reeves. It appeared Vanessa had orchestrated elaborate cons on past lovers, siphoning money through dubious real estate deals and marketing ventures. Several of Vanessa's former associates had been swindled, some too ashamed to go public. But now, Elizabeth had a folder of evidence that threatened to expose Vanessa as a fraud. Elizabeth decided to hold on to that folder for the moment, letting the wedding spectacle unfold. She sensed that unveiling the truth at the right time could ensure that Jonathan wouldn't weasel out of his responsibilities as a father. Moreover, she felt it was better for him to discover Vanessa's true nature when he was at his most complacent. After all, if he was brazen enough to marry his mistress immediately after divorcing her while she was still pregnant, perhaps he deserved the harsh lesson fate was about to deliver. And so, in Italy, under the shimmering lights of a grand villa, Jonathan said, "I do," to Vanessa. They exchanged vows in front of a cheering crowd. A high-profile priest, flown in just for the occasion, declared them man and wife. Fireworks lit the night sky, champagne flowed freely, and paparazzi snapped countless pictures for the gossip magazines to devour. But as Jonathan and Vanessa shared their first dance, a quiet storm was brewing thousands of miles away. It was a storm named Elizabeth, carrying the knowledge of Vanessa's lies like a secret weapon. At home in her modest bedroom, Elizabeth held a copy of the evidence in her hands. She gently set it aside, placed a hand on her very pregnant belly, and smiled, a small, knowing smile. She knew the wedding was only an intermission, not the end of the story, and when the final act played out, Vanessa Reeves would wish she had never underestimated the woman she tried so hard to destroy. Elizabeth went into labor a month after Jonathan's grand Italian wedding. She found herself in a private hospital suite, courtesy of the settlement from the divorce. Even though she was alone, except for a few close friends, she felt a surge of both fear and exhilaration. This child would be her anchor, the one pure thing born from a turbulent marriage. Complications arose during labor, prompting an emergency C-section. Margaret Turner clutched Elizabeth's hand as medical staff wheeled her into surgery. Hours later, a healthy baby boy was delivered, and Elizabeth breathed a sigh of relief. She named him James Douglas Harrington, honoring her family name and acknowledging his father's lineage. Jonathan learned of his son's birth through social media. Distorted rumors claimed Elizabeth was in critical condition, though that wasn't true. Still, guilt stabbed at him for not being there. Vanessa suggested he send flowers or a polite message. After all, she rationalized, we don't want the media to think you're a deadbeat dad. But a part of Jonathan insisted on visiting in person, if only to see his child. He arrived at the hospital the next evening, hoping to avoid the paparazzi. Dressed in a discreet hoodie and sunglasses, he found Elizabeth's private room. She was sitting up in bed, cradling tiny James in her arms. The boy's delicate features stirred something in Jonathan. A flicker of paternal love he hadn't expected to feel so strongly. For a few moments, he stood silently, absorbing the sight of his newborn son and the serene strength in Elizabeth's face. Elizabeth acknowledged him with a nod. "You can hold him," she said softly, offering the baby. Jonathan hesitated before gently taking James, supporting his head as he gazed down at his child. A wave of emotion washed over him, momentarily dissolving the tension between them. "How are you?" he asked, voice shaky with genuine concern. Elizabeth nodded. "Tired, but relieved. He's healthy. That's all that matters." A tense silence followed. Then Elizabeth cleared her throat. "Jonathan, you should know. There are things about Vanessa you aren't aware of." He frowned, stiffening. "She's my wife now, Elizabeth. I'm not sure I want to hear—" Elizabeth held up a hand. "Listen to me. I have proof she's been running cons under multiple aliases for years. She's scammed people out of thousands, maybe millions of dollars. She's not the woman you think she is." Jonathan glared, torn between anger and confusion. "Is this some ploy to ruin my marriage?" he snapped. Elizabeth sighed, stroking James's tiny fingers. "Why would I lie? She's done more harm to you than you realize. Check her financial records. Talk to the people she's scammed. Don't let her drag you into legal or financial ruin." Before Jonathan could respond, the door swung open, revealing Vanessa herself. Decked in designer clothes, she looked thoroughly out of place in the hospital corridor. Her expression soured when she saw Jonathan cradling his son. She quickly recovered, turning to Elizabeth. "I heard you were here," she said coldly, "so I came to see if everything was all right." Elizabeth offered a tight smile. "We're fine," she replied, glancing at Vanessa's manicured nails. "Thanks for your concern." Vanessa's eyes flitted to the baby. "So, that's James, I suppose?" She managed a lukewarm smile that didn't reach her eyes. Jonathan found himself shifting uncomfortably, the baby still in his arms. The tension in the room was palpable. Sensing an impending confrontation, Elizabeth's doctor walked in, checking on the new mother. "The baby should get some rest," the doctor advised, ushering Vanessa and Jonathan toward the hallway. Once outside, Vanessa attempted to link her arm through Jonathan's. "Let's go. We should get a drink and talk." But he pulled away, mind still grappling with Elizabeth's words. "Give me a moment," he mumbled, pacing near the wall. Vanessa shot him an icy stare. "Don't tell me you believe her lies. She's desperate to paint me as some villain. She's threatened by our marriage." Jonathan didn't respond immediately. A swirl of doubt had already formed. The problem was, deep down, he knew Elizabeth was not the type to spin elaborate falsehoods. She was the woman who had always been straightforward, sometimes painfully so. "I need proof," he finally said to Vanessa. "Show me your financials." Put my mind at ease." Vanessa's face blanched, but she recovered swiftly. "What do you think this is, an interrogation?" she hissed. "I'm your wife. You're supposed to trust me." "Trust is earned," he shot back, surprising even himself. "If you have nothing to hide, you'll show me." Vanessa's lips tightened in anger. Without another word, she stormed off down the hallway, leaving Jonathan behind, torn between the newborn son he felt drawn to and the woman he had chosen in a haze of infatuation. If Elizabeth's allegations were true, his entire world was about to explode, and if they were false, he risked alienating his new wife. Caught in the middle, Jonathan could only stare at the hospital corridor, uncertain which direction to follow, and which choice would haunt him more. After leaving the hospital, Jonathan found himself haunted by Elizabeth's revelations about Vanessa. He pushed for answers, combing through public records and discreetly checking with his legal team. At first, they uncovered nothing alarming, mostly because Vanessa had been careful. But a few well-placed phone calls to her supposed real estate partners yielded conflicting stories. Some claimed never to have heard of her. Others said she'd disappeared after complicated deals. The puzzle pieces began to align. Meanwhile, Vanessa caught wind of Jonathan's sleuthing and retaliated. She insisted he sign power of attorney forms, allowing her to handle some upcoming investments, framing it as a way to simplify his busy schedule. When he hesitated, she raged, throwing accusations and threats. "You don't trust me," she shouted one evening in their opulent living room. "Why did you marry me if you can't give me the freedom to help run our affairs?" Jonathan's patience wore thin. "I married you because I thought we had something special," he retorted. "Now I'm not so sure." Her eyes flashed with hatred. She stormed off, slamming the door, and didn't return that night. But Jonathan wasn't alone. He spent hours calling contacts and scanning financial statements. The deeper he dug, the clearer the picture became. Vanessa was a fraud, a con artist who specialized in ensnaring wealthy men. During this tumultuous period, Elizabeth settled into motherhood, focusing on baby James. Despite her heartbreak, she found profound joy in caring for her son. Late-night feedings and lullabies replaced the noise of tabloids and gossip. She made a point of never speaking ill of Jonathan to James, and she filed away the heartbreak in a locked chamber of her heart. When she felt strong enough, she instructed her lawyer to finalize the custody and visitation terms with Jonathan's legal team. She wanted James to know his father, provided Jonathan could be responsible. One afternoon, a courier arrived at Elizabeth's door with an envelope addressed to her. She opened it carefully, finding a thick wad of legal documents from Jonathan's lawyer. At the top was a note scribbled by Jonathan himself. "Elizabeth, I owe you an apology. You were right about Vanessa. Please look at these documents. I want to ensure James and you are protected. Let's discuss custody arrangements in person." Jonathan skimming through the pages, Elizabeth learned that Jonathan had begun divorce proceedings against Vanessa, citing fraud and emotional distress. He was also reorganizing his assets to ensure Vanessa couldn't claim a share of his core business holdings. A sense of relief washed over her, knowing that the truth was finally emerging. But it wasn't over yet. Vanessa unleashed a final hailstorm of vengeance once she realized Jonathan planned to divorce her. She went public with salacious tales, painting Jonathan as an abusive manipulator who had cast her aside. She threatened to sue for a massive alimony settlement, claiming she'd given up her career to be at his side. She even claimed to be pregnant, though nobody could verify it. The tabloids ate it up, and Jonathan's reputation wavered. His shareholders grew anxious. The stock price for one of his newer ventures dipped. That was the moment Elizabeth decided to act. She might have moved on from Jonathan romantically, but she had no desire to watch him be destroyed, especially when it might hurt her son's future. She reached out to a trusted journalist, Sarah Donovan, an old acquaintance who had interviewed Jonathan years ago. Elizabeth handed over the files incriminating Vanessa, the forged signatures, the false business claims, testimonies from past victims. She explained the entire sordid saga on the condition that Sarah would wait for court validation before publishing. In a high-stakes courtroom showdown, Jonathan's legal team presented overwhelming evidence against Vanessa. Lawyers brought forth witnesses, former partners, private investigators who spoke of her deceitful tactics. Financial forensics revealed shell corporations used to launder stolen funds. Each exhibit was a nail in the coffin of Vanessa's carefully curated image. Furious, Vanessa screeched about defamation and sabotage, but the judge found her statements inconsistent and her credibility in tatters. When the final gavel struck, the court ruled in Jonathan's favor. The marriage was declared null due to fraudulent circumstances. Vanessa was ordered to pay restitution for any assets proven to be stolen or misrepresented. As she was escorted out by court security, the paparazzi captured her meltdown, eyes wild, hair disheveled, cursing Jonathan and Elizabeth in a venomous tirade. The next day's headlines read, "Fraudulent Mistress Exposed, Jonathan Harrington Free of Con Artist Bride." For Jonathan, the aftermath was a bitter relief. He had lost credibility in many circles, but the truth had come out. He also realized the depth of the pain he'd inflicted on Elizabeth. After the dust settled, he called her and asked to see baby James. She agreed to a meeting at a cozy cafe near the hospital where James was born. When Jonathan arrived, he found Elizabeth waiting with James dozing in a stroller. The hush of the cafe and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee gave the encounter a subdued warmth. Jonathan quietly sat across from Elizabeth, eyes dropping to the baby. Guilt and regret lined his face. "How is he?" Jonathan asked, voice thick. Elizabeth smiled gently. "He's thriving, growing so quickly. He'll be crawling before we know it." Jonathan swallowed hard, guilt flooding him. "Liz, I'm sorry. I can't say it enough. I was a fool." She studied him for a moment, then reached out to pat his hand. "Our marriage is over, Jonathan," she said, her tone honest, yet not unkind. "But that doesn't mean we can't work together to raise our son." He nodded, tears glistening in his eyes. "Thank you for standing up for me in court. You could have let Vanessa destroy me." Elizabeth shook her head. "I did it for James. He deserves a future where his father isn't tied up in lawsuits and scandal. And part of me still respects the good man you used to be." Jonathan exhaled, relief and sorrow mingling. "I want to be that man again," he whispered, gently brushing his fingers over James's tiny hand. They spent the next hour discussing visitation schedules, financial planning for James's education, and how to navigate co-parenting. It wasn't an easy conversation. Emotions simmered beneath the surface: love, betrayal, regret. But there was also a mutual desire to provide the best life for their child. By the time they parted ways, Elizabeth felt a weight lift from her shoulders. They weren't returning to the life they had, but they were forging a new path, one grounded in honesty, if not love. Jonathan watched them go, a swirl of regret and admiration filling his heart. He knew he'd forever be marked by the choice he made to chase a fleeting thrill with Vanessa. And Elizabeth, for her part, walked away with her head held high, proud of the grace she maintained in the face of heartbreak. The next morning, newspapers displayed photos of a distraught Vanessa leaving the courthouse, overshadowed by articles praising Elizabeth's quiet dignity. Tabloid interest soon shifted to other scandals, leaving Jonathan and Elizabeth to navigate their complicated new reality in relative peace. Thus ended the whirlwind saga of betrayal, heartbreak, and deceit. Jonathan Harrington, once seduced by the allure of a cunning mistress, emerged bruised but wiser. Elizabeth, his pregnant wife left smiling on divorce day, had always known the truth, that Vanessa was a fraud waiting to be exposed. She stood her ground, protected her child, and refused to be a victim. In the end, Jonathan and Elizabeth found an uneasy truce, both determined to raise baby James in a stable environment. Their story became a cautionary tale, proving that no amount of wealth or glamour can mask a guilty conscience or hide deception forever.